We're returning now to our coverage of the Victorian election with more analysis as we wait for the polls to close. Live from Melbourne is Dr. Katie Allen, former federal Liberal MP. Katie, appreciate your time. Thank you so much. I understand you've been out and about at a polling booth today in Malvern, I understand. What's the mood you've been picking up on there?
Thanks, Ash. Well, yes, I've been out there since 8 a.m. this morning. I just popped off for an hour to come in here, and the mood is very buoyant towards the Liberals, I have to say. In Malvern, I think there's really no question that Michael O'Brien, the current incumbent, will be returned in Malvern. What was surprising to me in Malvern anyway was how few how-to-vote cards for Labor were being taken. It's definitely number 2 would be the Greens, and certainly we're not seeing much love for Dan Andrews, particularly in Malvern.
More broadly, Malvern aside, what's your expectation of the result? You're a keen political observer. Do you expect Dan Andrews will have to wrangle a minority government?
Well, I've been to a number of early voting booths across Victoria particularly across Melbourne in the last 2 weeks. And it's very clear that this is a referendum on Dan Andrews. And so, as we know, polling can be very difficult to predict these days. But I think polling as a science has come under question, partly because the way that the market or social media and the media market is so much more fragmented, and it's very hard to predict seat by seat. So what I think we'll see is some surprising results in some seats. And I think the areas to watch in Victoria in particular in this election will be the outer east seats. I think there's pretty reasonable evidence that there's a lot of anger against Dan Andrews, and particularly the sleeper issue in this election is the COVID lockdowns, the arrogance of Dan Andrews and not explaining what he was doing and why he was doing it. And those people who did COVID hard. So there kind of seems to be the difference between, some people who didn't seem to mind COVID lockdown, and there are others who really did it hard, who lost their businesses, they might have lost their marriages, mental health issues with their children, issues that they just can't forget about. And the waiting lists for the health sector have gone through the roof. And they're angry that the arrogance of Dan Andrews with the way that he handled COVID, and they're not prepared to explain what happened and why, particularly with the quarantine fiasco and then with the terrible contact tracing and driving basically the public health response into the ground. So having to use a one-size-fits-all with regards to lockdown when people looked across the border and saw a very different response to COVID in other states. So the virus was the same across the country, but there was a very different response. And I think what we're left with here in Victoria is this massive debt issue, with more debt in Victoria than in New South Wales, Queensland and Tasmania combined, which is a very bad place for the second largest state-based economy in the country to be in. But worse than that, our credit rating is taking a real hit, and that's going to have a big impact on how we pay back this massive debt that we've been saddled with. And that debt can be put at the foot of, unfortunately, a poor response, particularly a letdown in the contact tracing system, and therefore a poor response to COVID.